Okay, thank you very much for coming. It's my delight to introduce Joanna Wester to you. Joanna teaches at the University of Western Ontario, Canada, and she works in areas that are cognate and relevant to areas that we work in here, although like most other countries in the world, the reference to superannuation is not superannuation but pensions. Apparently in Australia that's not the right word, and having spent 40 years in Britain, I tell people I've got quite an interesting pension agreement here, to be told, well, what is my disability? So Joanna's going to talk to us about pension fund governance, superannuation fund governance. Joanna works in this broad area, in the area of labour studies, and many of us are going to Canada shortly to the CRIMP conference, and Joanna's associated with CRIMP as well, which is an important North American research network. So Joanna, welcome to Australia, welcome to here, and it's all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much to the Centre for Sustainable Organisations and Work for having me. This is really great. It's my first time in Australia, and I've had a really nice week in Melbourne so far with excellent hosts, and tomorrow we'll see my first penguin in the flesh, I hope, with the little parade. So today I'm going to talk about sort of ongoing research. I've been working in the area of pension governance since I was a graduate student. Started working through a larger banner called Pensions at Work. There was a group out of the University of Toronto that received a large federal grant to sort of study the sustainable investment of union-based pension funds, which I'm gathering are sort of similar to your industry funds. And there were lots of people working on different aspects of that, but one of the pieces where I started fitting into the puzzle was looking specifically at the role of labor trustees. From my perspective as somebody who studies industrial and labor relations, coming to understand pensions from people who sort of make day-to-day decisions about pensions is not something that there's a lot of literature on out there in the world. There's more on sort of the impacts of pensions or pension investments as an end product, but not so much in what's going on with the people who are sort of sitting on these boards. So I was working with a colleague, Anil Verma, on this, and we started thinking about the ideas of role conflict and role ambiguity. These were kind of the two ideas we had at the start, thinking that for the most part, even though it sounds very straightforward that people who are pension trustees or superannuation trustees have the role to protect the plan, to protect the money of the beneficiaries, protect the beneficiaries in the plan. And that's often kind of lobbied about as a very straightforward role. That's what pension trustees do. But we were sort of thinking that actually maybe that role might not be so straightforward because there's a little bit more space, a little bit more interpretation around some of those terms that hadn't really been explored. So we thought that perhaps labor trustees in particular might experience a little bit of ambiguity in this role. And also in terms of the Canadian context, labor trustees may experience a bit of sort of role conflict because, and I think it might be a little different in some of the Australian context, but a lot of unions weren't sort of involved in pension governance, aside from bargaining the contribution levels of pensions in the sort of collective bargaining relationships with the employer. Unions would be very involved in trying to get robust contributions into a pension plan, but came a little later to sort of being involved in pension governance per se. And there are distinguished between sort of public sector involvement and private sector involvement. But sort of historically, there were still a number of unions, major unions in the Canadian context, who felt that really crossing over into that land of pension governance was not something that unions should do. The Canadian Auto Workers Union is sort of the primary example of that. They're now called Unifor. But their position for a long time on pensions was this is not our responsibility. Our responsibility as unionists is not to get involved in the financial markets. Our responsibility is to make sure that we have good contributions into a fund, and we will bargain for those, full stop. But that landscape has evolved, particularly in some ways for public sector unions, and that's where some of this kind of role conflict comes in. And in some of the research we've done, which is essentially surveying and interviewing labor trustees and other pension trustees, primarily in the Canadian context, there are aspects of that, of this ambiguity around the role, labor trustees coming to their positions and experiencing quite a steep learning curve, particularly if they weren't already active in their unions as say union staffers on the pensions and benefits committees, you know, learning the actuarial science, etc., around pension investments was quite a steep learning curve. Also hearing from labor trustees that there wasn't a very strong connection, quite a tenuous connection actually, between their role as trustees and the union who put them into that role, which often led to some ambiguity about what were they supposed to be doing there. And those issues, the training being sort of quite piecemeal in terms of how to get up to speed on that learning curve. So it sort of begged us to ask the question, you know, well, what's the role of labor then? What is labor's voice in pensions governance? When there was sort of this sense of not being so sure of what the role actually was, what the purpose actually was. And that was really the starting point that kind of led us to ask a number of different questions, and kind of leads to this discussion today, which is around the role, the purpose of labor in pension governance, the aspirations, the things that labor might like to achieve, versus perhaps some of the realities, the day-to-day barriers or challenges to those aspirations that trustees face every day. So that's what we're going to talk about over the next little bit. If I can. So Peter has already made my first caveat, which I thought I could maybe remember to say superannuation throughout my talk. I don't think I'm capable of doing so pension as it is. I also think that a number of you in the room maybe know this distinction, but just to set some context for those who don't, in terms of how pensions operate, there are sort of two levels. There's a sponsor level, and that tends to be where the contribution levels for pensions are negotiated. It tends to be more of a negotiated space, so maybe this happens at the bargaining table, where the labor side and the employer side come together and they figure out, okay, what are the percentages going to be, what are the contributions into the fund. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what happens at the sponsor level. What this talk is about is what we call the fiduciary board or the administrative board, which is the board of trustees that is then charged with managing and dealing with the funds that come in that are negotiated down from the sponsor level, hiring fund managers, deciding on investment policy, deciding on particular how benefits are paid out in particularly unique cases, etc., is where the sort of role of the trustee lives. And so that's the space that we're going to talk about primarily. And this is really based on the Canadian context, and hopefully when I'm finished talking we can get into maybe a bit of discussion about how any of this potentially resonates or is different from what goes on in the Australian context. There's a handful of interviews in this batch that we've been doing from the UK and some from the US as well, but primarily these interviews are from Canadian pension trustees, labor, and also employer side trustees as well. So but I'll focus on the labor ones today. So I was speaking last week with a senior pensions researcher from quite a large public sector plan in Canada around this idea of labor's role in pension governance, and he has been essentially studying pensions and working on his union's agenda around pension governance and pension involvement for a long time. And he was really saying, you know, from his perspective, he sees that there's a real contradiction for labor to be involved in pensions, because we think about pensions as a retirement system. We think about the role of unions historically in sort of providing a system of mutual assurance for members, for workers, and in terms of social safety nets and welfare states. This is where the idea of retirement security came from. But in the context of pensions, that pension system is really resting on a system of capital that has become increasingly financialized, and many would argue in kind of our neoliberal environments has become increasingly predatory, increasingly antisocial, increasingly sort of destructive to a lot of the kind of mutual assurance principles that unions or sort of other kind of left-leaning progressives may carry around. So the idea that unions are then involved in the governance of a system that is so embedded in a sort of predatory capital is a little bit uncomfortable perhaps, but it's not something that's talked about a whole lot in terms of how we understand these things. And one of the things that this pension trustee was talking to me about was that over the years in the labor movement, he's sort of been educated into kind of one response for this potential conundrum, which is that yes, pensions, the capital system on which pensions rest can be kind of an ugly business, but the opportunity for labor there could be potentially very great. The opportunity for labor to enter into pension fund governance in order to kind of grab or access a new form of power, a new form of potential power that can then allow unions to have a space at that table that potentially could be used for good, whatever that means, and maybe act as a bit of a band-aid or as a bit of a barrier, perhaps, a mitigating factor against some of these sort of more predatory aspects of capital. And so part of that is has led to, I think, an approach towards pensions that some unionists have taken, definitely people who would call themselves pension activists have taken, and this is a little bit grayed out, but in terms of engagement in socially responsible investing, economically targeted investing, it's the thinking behind various divestment campaigns, so for pensions to perhaps not invest in companies that make landmines or not invest in particularly toxic products, for example. There have been campaigns around tobacco and various things. The idea behind using your proxies, voting your proxies as a shareholder in a company, a lot of pension plans have the ability to vote their proxies in various ways, and potentially there's a way to vote those in a way that would then support socially responsible or progressive agendas, however you want to sort of define those things. And then sometimes pension plans, because they're incredibly large institutional investors, also have sufficient numbers of shares in companies that they could actually have a direct impact on the management of those companies. Maybe they even sit on the board, someone sits on the board of those companies, or at the very least they have a more direct, a more greased conduit into the management teams of some of these companies that perhaps they could influence how those run. Some pension plans are so large that they're beginning to own companies outright. And so now pension funds are actually owners and managers themselves in various contexts. And underneath all of this is sort of the idea of applying a union worldview to the investment of pension money. But as we'll maybe talk about more, that's a very wide term as well, and anyone who has been involved in the labor movement knows that there may not be a universal union worldview. Lots of unions have different approaches, different philosophies, different ideologies, and so in terms of these aspirations, there isn't a clear path. There's not a clear right one. Which one of these is the best? Which one of these should we all be doing? And the sort of development of these approaches has been kind of in fits and starts, really, across the last number of years. I think we can agree that generally, corporate governance, increased transparency is moving us towards a little bit more discussion of some of these aspects of alternative investment. But it hasn't been an overwhelmingly large uptake in most contexts. So there's sort of a question mark that remains on this aspirational side, a question mark that remains for, you know, the argument that this unionist was sort of educated in, was that, oh no, labor is going to be a force for good in these pension plans, but that hasn't sort of necessarily come to fruition. And what some people argue, and what this particular person that I was speaking to last week would say, is that pensions remain a very strong contradiction for labor, and maybe pensions are actually becoming more of a contradiction for labor, because the actions that we see some pension plans or pension funds engaged in are becoming more problematic for our understanding in this wide interpretation of a union worldview that might not sit quite right with some of our understanding of the ideologies or philosophies of labor. This particular trustee is in the public sector, and for him, you know, he said it's sort of literally blown his mind how much he's seeing public pension plans in Canada being not passive investors in things like privatization of public services, public utilities, public goods, but actually very strong, active, and innovative actors in that kind of movement throughout the sort of international context. And a few examples of that, and so, you know, his conclusion would be perhaps labor isn't sort of acting as these roadblocks. Perhaps there's not being that much of an impact of these labor trustees at all, because we see things like this. And this is the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, which is a highly successful pension plan that is for public sector teachers who are at the elementary and secondary level in the province of Ontario in Canada. And the teachers plan just recently outright purchased this company, Busy Bees Nursery in the UK, which is a for-profit childcare provider. We're the largest for-profit childcare providers in the UK. And the teachers plan came under a little bit of fire there, because it's sort of interesting that a pension plan that is made up of money from people who are fighting quite rigorously to maintain a public education system in their own home country is now the primary owner of privatized nurseries in the UK. And one of the quotes from a representative from the teachers plan who is based in London said, let's see, I'll read it out. Busy Bees will make more acquisitions in both the UK and abroad. We're interested in exporting the brand anywhere with expat communities, and think there are opportunities in Europe, possibly through a combined offering with another operator, maybe one that does education, but not daycare. So now, even more so, they may move into actually, the teachers' pension plan is now owners of privatized education systems around the world. And the CEO of Busy Bees, who I guess was a teacher before he came into this business, says, we were all teachers, and we really like the idea that a teacher's pension fund is backing us. It feels right for us. Well, okay. So that's a little tricky. Another example, and these are just other holdings for that matter of the teacher's pension plan. There are part holdings in the Sydney desalination plant, I learned just the other day as I was doing some research on this. They're also part owners in the UK's high-speed rail link linking London and the Channel Tunnel, owned jointly with OMERS, which incidentally is another Canadian-based public sector municipal workers retirement system. And I see they're also joint owners of Birmingham Airport with Australia's VFMC plan. So there's some nice Australian and Canadian linkages there in terms of owning some public, now private utilities. Oh, going the wrong way. As another potentially problematic example, this is a fund in Quebec, which is another province in Canada. The case that they call is Canada's second biggest pension fund manager. This is a picture of their CEO, Michael Saglia. And he was recently, there was a big article, because he flew into LaGuardia Airport in New York and was lamenting the terrible state of the infrastructure of the airport, and said, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if the Americans would just wake up and stop thinking that all of these things had to be managed publicly, which is a funny thing for a Canadian to be saying about the American context, and let pension funds come in and buy up these airports so that their infrastructure could be brought up to speed. Also, the case is quite active and quite open in saying that they're targeting infrastructure projects all around the world, in the US, Mexico, Australia. They already have holdings in Heathrow Airport and the Port of Brisbane. In the Canadian context, they have holdings in Enbridge and in the TransCanada Pipeline, so two very large pipelines, companies that are really embroiled right now in the Canadian context in highly contentious pipeline projects, the Northern Gateway Pipeline and the Keystone XL Pipeline, that environmentalists and Aboriginal groups are fighting. President Obama in the States has come out to veto the Keystone XL Pipeline, but this public sector pension plan is really in favor of all of these because pipelines and oil and gas are a good investment. As a third problematic example, this book is a newish book from two economists, labor researchers out of the United States, Eileen Applebaum and Rosemary Batt. It's Private Equity at Work. It talks about the destructive role of private equity and how there's lots of growing evidence of how private equity firms are sort of degrading work. I'm not an expert in private equity, but what I understand is that a lot of these private equity firms kind of build their model by engaging in corporate raids where they actually leverage the assets of the target company in order to buy the company. So it's a little bit of a vicious circle there. And when they buy the company, then there is a lot of debt on the company's books because the private equity firm has borrowed the company's own money in order to buy the company. So now the target firm has all of this debt on their books, and that acts as a very sound justification to then bring in very lean, aggressive management techniques that often result in shedding jobs or various bankruptcies and foreclosures, and is not exactly the sort of up-and-coming model for job generation from a worker's perspective. Where that ties in with pensions is that one of the stats in this book is that 35% of the investment capital in private equity firms is from institutional pension plans. So these pension plans are actively supporting companies that don't have the greatest track record in terms of building employment. So that's all kind of context, really, to the purpose of my talk, because what I'm focused on is really what's happening with trustees, what's happening at the board level, here in the middle in terms of board decision making, because boards, people, are making the decisions to invest in this way, right? And if there are labor trustees at that board, it leads us a little bit to question, well, what's going on at that board that is allowing, enabling these actions or inhibiting some sort of different action? And that's really where the heart of this talk is going to go now, is sort of examining some of the barriers, or what we might call the realities, that labor trustees face in any attempt to sort of engage in those aspirational aspects of sort of alternative pension investment that we were talking about before. So I've tried to pull them out here into constituency. We'll talk about constituency, we'll talk about expertise, which I gather is sort of a growing hot topic in the Australian context. Talk about the role of consensus on these boards, and also kind of fiduciary duty. But as you may know, or as you'll see, fiduciary duty really kind of is in all of those pockets, and there is a lot of interrelatedness between all of these aspects or all of these themes around board governance. I've tried to pull them out a little bit to make the talk have some sort of logical flow, but there's a lot of connection across here. So in terms of talking about constituent groups, if we go back to the idea of having pension sponsors and the fiduciary board, the way we get from the sponsor to having people at the fiduciary or the administrative board of trustees is that the sponsor tends to get to appoint people to the fiduciary board. Okay? So if we have a labor sponsor and an employer sponsor of the pension fund, these are the two groups that pay into the pension fund, then those groups appoint representatives to the trustee board. In a jointly sponsored pension plan, usually you see a joint trustee board. So there will be 4 labor representatives, 4 employer representatives. Usually there's a rotating chair system, or maybe there's an independent chair who sits to kind of break a tie. That implies that constituency seems to matter, right? If we bother talking about trustee boards as having labor trustees and employer trustees, or government ex officio members, or independent trustees, why bother labeling those trustees as different if they're not different, right? If they're all just trustees, then just call them trustees. Who cares at the sponsor level who gets to appoint what trustees and how they get appointed if they all end up being the same on the pension board table, right? And so in that thinking, you'd think there must be a difference, right? There must be something unique about labor trustees. They must be bringing something perhaps unique to the board table if we are so kind of cued into thinking about them in a different way and making sure that there's an equal representation of people at the board, or that there's an independent chair to break a tie. That implies that people are voting in blocks, maybe. But what we find is actually that that's not really universally the case. And from a lot of trustees, this is labor trustees, this is government appointed ex officio trustees, this is from employer trustees, is that there's a strong rejection of the notion that they are representing a constituent group. Rather, there is the link to fiduciary duty. So I'm a trustee on the pension plan, and my job is to protect the money of the beneficiaries, right? And that's a common understanding from all the trustees on the board. So the idea of the constituent group from which you come really falls out for most trustees on the board. And I'm just going to give you, this looks really long-winded, I know, it breaks all the rules of PowerPoint slides, but I'll read them out. Because I think what's most interesting in this research is really what trustees say, and they're really quite illuminating in terms of how trustees are kind of grappling with some of this. So this is a quote from a labor trustee who is sitting on a multi-employer pension plan in the private sector. And this trustee says, yeah, I don't see myself as representing the sponsor, frankly. I see myself really in, I would say, exclusively in a fiduciary role on the board. You know, that's really what shapes my decision making and my thinking about the plan. And I would say exclusively. I really don't think in terms of my relations to my sponsors. The reporting that goes on, back to the sponsor, is very slim, very slate. I have a great deal of autonomy to serve as a trustee on the board. So there's no representation in the sense that I'm accountable back to the sponsor that appointed me. Sort of example of that thinking. So is this one. Another labor trustee saying, most of us leave our union bags or employer bags at the door and just try and act in the interest of beneficiaries. And so now this trustee is commenting on sort of an earlier question that we asked about, well, you know, do you engage in debates around privatization? You know, how does that go down at the table? And he says, so this is sort of a doctrinaire position. People who have a belief that to earn money off a social service is a sin. And then it's just a belief. There's no real actual basis to it. If a profit operation could offer good service and good value, they showed us an adequate income stream, we wouldn't rule it out as a good place to invest. And so we do engage in private operation of public business. And then he goes on to say, I mean, once they're on the block, the cake's pretty much cooked. It's just who's going to eat it. And this is a senior, let me emphasize, senior union official in the public sector. He's been a public sector unionist for much of his life, who's saying, at the end of the day, these things are up for grabs, and we might as well invest in these companies, and since someone's going to anyway, right? So it might as well be us. This one's a little more dense. This person also says, using these pools of capital as instruments for social betterment and improvement, I don't see the link. This is again a labor trustee who is a senior labor trustee, a senior unionist. They wouldn't see the link, this is other trustees, because they kind of accept that this world of financial markets and financial capital is kind of a problem. It's suffocating the real economy, and it needs to be tackled as a separate problem rather than utilized in some way. There's a kind of basic commitment, I think, a residual commitment to the idea that these pensions are about benefits for workers. They're partly paid for by workers, partly paid as deferred compensations from the employer, and you know, they must be paid. That's a commitment, and the other stuff can't be allowed to get in the way of that. So even though you and I may agree that wouldn't it be nice, and we have commitments in the rest of our working lives to being activists in these areas, but there isn't a feeling like there's a simple kind of match-up where you can kill two birds with one stone. So the conclusions from this is that there isn't a union worldview on the pension boards of trustees. There's not space for it in the context of the fiduciary duty to make sure that this pension plan is going to pay out in terms of the retirement benefits for those members. That's where the commitment lies. Pension plans are not a place for innovation. They're not a place for social radicalism, as much as some of the labor trustees would say on the side, maybe that'd be nice, and I spend the whole rest of my day job as a unionist engaged in those fights, but I don't engage in those fights at the pension board table, because that's not where those arguments belong. There's not a place for those things. It's too risky for the beneficiaries to be engaging in that kind of action. That said, because I don't want to sort of leave us with a sense that labor trustees really just sort of lose all sense of themselves necessarily on the board, there is a space, there's a little narrow space of overlap with the idea of being a unionist and the idea of being a pension trustee do allow some exercise of a perhaps slightly different perspective on the board. And these happen to really come up in terms of conversations around potential benefit reductions or potential hikes in contributions. So typically where the fund is underfunded or facing some sort of stress to the system, which a lot of pension funds, particularly in defined benefit plans, which we still have in Canada, in the public sector experience, that this is where there is a difference, that the labor trustee can bring actually quite a useful and unique context to the table, because they may advocate something that is going to sort of lessen the blow of these decisions for the beneficiaries in a way that maybe someone who is strictly looking at the numbers on a piece of paper wouldn't necessarily come to. And here's a series of comments. This is the same trustee talking about this issue, who says historically the issue on this plan, this is a private sector plan again, multiple employer plan, has been the unevenness in the sense that the labor side trustee are very much more engaged in the workplaces that place members into the plan and in the evolution and governance of the plan. The employer side has been a little more disengaged, and employers have not been as well organized or as assiduous in appointing trustees to the board who have a foot in the industry. And it turns out that actually a lot of the employer trustees in this particular plan are retired. So they're not even active employers anymore. So they're pretty removed from the day-to-day of what's going on in these organizations. And the trustee goes on to say, and so they don't have the degree of, I guess, on-the-ground knowledge that the labor side reps do, because the union reps are pension benefits reps for their unions. They know exactly what's happening with bargaining and with the mood in the workplace and the concerns that are being raised. So they are a direct conduit. They're enormously important to the board in that regard because they can convey an effective transmission up and down for connecting members' views and a board perception. And really what that's around is just a little bit of adjustment in the board decisions where maybe the contribution rates need to be increased. The board universally decides, yes, that's what we need to do because we're facing some sort of liability issue. But let's not just tomorrow increase the rates by X%, because that would be a little bit of a shock to the beneficiaries, a little bit of a shock to these real people who the labor trustees are better able to express that we're talking about real people here and not about numbers on a page necessarily, and say, can we phase this in, right? Yep, we're going to increase contribution rates, but can we phase it in over a period of time so it's a little bit less of a shock? Same idea with benefit reductions. Let's all not jump off a cliff here. Can we sort of phase this down so it's a little bit less of an aggressive change? So at the margin, there's some space there to take different approaches. And the sense is, at least from labor trustees, from their own discussions of what they bring to the board, that they're well placed to engage in some of that distinction. So it doesn't fundamentally change the investment decision, but maybe it alters it a little bit at the margins. And so that leads us into a discussion of expertise, really. Does it? Does it? It does. Because what we're then talking about is a particular expertise that labor trustees bring, a particular quality, a particular set of skills or experiences or a particular sensibility that perhaps does set them apart from those other trustees on the board. And this is really where we get into this kind of the debate, and in the academic literature it's often called the prudence versus professionalism debate, or you might hear it the lay board versus the professional board debate. And this is a debate that's live right now. And the idea of, well, this is a tough job, right? This is a hard job and people need to be skilled. People need to be technically skilled. And what that means in its interpretation often is that they have to be skilled in actuarial science or in, you know, the best finance reporting mechanisms or whatever it happens to be. It's all around the numbers, around the ability to interpret investment plans, etc. Very little of the discussion in this prudence professional debate spends much time on what are the other things, what are the other skills, competencies, whatever you want to call them, that are important to have on a pension board. And a number of these skills, in terms of how labor trustees experience it, are quite critical when you think about a sort of an institutional context. And a number of us are people who study industrial and labor relations, for whom the institutional context is often quite important. What workplaces are in this plan? What sector is it? Who are these workers? Where have we come from? Those things matter. And so one trustee says, we don't use an expert board, we use a lay board. We want trustees who have an alignment with our plan and our members in it, and then we can teach them the rest, right? We can teach them the financial expertise. And that's sort of a direct contrary argument to the prevailing argument, or at least the argument that is trying to become the prevailing argument, which is, no, we need to have people who are financial experts to sit as trustees because it's too dangerous not to. They're managing all this money. We need to make sure that they're experts. But it's tricky because getting up to speed isn't isn't easy, and it's definitely a lot to learn in terms of how you go about managing a multi-million dollar pension plan. Is not something that you can just, you know, pick up on the back of the napkin. And labor trustees will say that it often takes 2 to 3 years to get up to speed, right? They serve really a full term on the board before they really feel like they're strong, active, contributing members to the plan. And so that's a challenge, because when you're not feeling like you have expertise in a particular environment, you may not be as likely to speak up or to challenge or to engage in alternative thinking, because you're just trying to sort of get by on the day-to-day. So there's sort of a mixed bag here in terms of what's going on. But I think we can't sort of forget the issue, because a lot of the skills that you need at a pension board table have to do with persuasion, have to do with a degree of political savviness, a degree of confidence in challenging the authority. Pension plans, the trustees sit around the table and a staff administrator comes in who tends to set the agenda. They tend to be the gatekeepers of information, and if the trustees are not comfortable saying, you may be an actuary, but you're not giving me the information I need, or I don't think that that's the way I would interpret that, then that administrative team is just going to kind of walk all over the trustees. Maybe that's okay if that administrative team is great, but it leaves for some questions, right, around the ability for the board to have oversight if really they're just kind of rubber stamping what their administrative staffers are saying. Or if a pension fund manager comes in and says, well, this is the way we're doing things, the board needs to be able to challenge that. And people who have sort of grown up in the labor movement are often well placed to challenge authority and to have the confidence and comfort level to do that. And those are all sort of, I don't like to, softer skills that might be potentially relevant at the board that get kind of lost in this discussion of skills. Going backwards. Volleyball is challenging. So that brings us into this sort of discussion around consensus as well, which is similarly tied to expertise, because when you're unsure of something, you're less likely to stick your neck out, right? You're more likely to kind of sit back and sort of see what the waters are like before you sort of engage in formulating your own opinion perhaps on that issue. Here's a quote from a labor trustee that kind of sums some of this up. He's talking about his development on the board over time. He says, here's a good case. Someone who's been in this business for decades, making this decision on a very principled basis, and here I am taking the opposite view. So it's tough. It's tough to be in that position. I mean, sometimes learning about their position on a matter, well, it always has an influence. I can't think of a time when it's caused me to kind of reverse where I've been going entirely. Maybe early on. And he says, yeah, definitely early on. In my experience on the board, it would have probably caused me to completely rethink where I've been leading. More recently, I found myself leaning in a certain direction that's otherwise at odds with what someone else has kind of proposed, but I'm better able to make a case for why I think it makes sense and defend it. These things are never black and white, I mean, sometimes it's like a crapshoot. And so this is sort of the evolution, the development of a person's expertise, a development of their confidence in their expertise, and that allows them to push back against consensus. Not that consensus is bad, right? It might be great, but consensus is sometimes problematic when there is a particular traditional way of understanding a problem. Consensus might be problematic. Groupthink is sometimes problematic. And so that's where sort of expertise can sometimes be an issue. And so in terms of a broad number of themes, I wasn't going to give you quotes on all of these topics, but there are lots of things tied to consensus, right? That experience is tied to consensus. The more experienced you are, the more able you are to go out on a limb on your own, to push back in a different way perhaps than the group. The more expertise you have, the more confidence you have in your own knowledge, the more you're likely to be able to question things on the board. Also, consensus is sometimes tied to the issue at hand. And so all of the people on the board may get to the same conclusion, but they may take different paths, or they may value different variables, different pieces of information in a different way. That could change how the decision is enacted. For instance, phasing in contribution hikes or phasing out benefits reductions. Depending on how you value different outcomes, how you value different ways to get to those outcomes, can often lead you down a slightly different path. But if nobody is bringing forward the fact that you can look at things differently or you can value things differently, you're not going to go down those other paths. And so that's a place where different perspectives sometimes become important. Consensus, as people may sometimes know from their own experiences, is tied to how long a group has been together. When teams have been working together for a long time, they become better able to understand each other. They become smoother operators, which is sometimes good, but also sometimes bad if they kind of get caught up in some of their own groupthink in that process. Respect of other trustees is also tied to whether there's a lot of consensus at the board. When you're new, you may be a little bit more in awe of the expertise of others. You may be on a board with representatives, if you're a labor trustee, from other unions. There are often multiple unions at the table, or other unionists who you know and you have respect for in your day-to-day work. Then you may be more likely to go along with what they have to say. On the flip side, you may also want to try to sort of establish your own respective view on the board, and that leads trustees to often work very, very hard to get up to speed and to know what they're talking about, because they kind of feel the judgment of others around the table. And these are all these sort of internal complicated factors that lead trustees to act in one way or another, and enable trustees to do something differently or cause them to do something the same. Board protocol also really matters. How do you make decisions? And usually we ask the trustees, well, how do you make decisions at the board? And they're not really sure how to go about answering that question. We kind of have to probe them a little bit. Do you vote? What do you do? Do you raise your hands? Do you have a secret ballot? And that process can matter, right? Sometimes there are some boards who say, we talk until we achieve consensus. And if we haven't achieved consensus, you imagine being at that board meeting, it sounds like an academic departmental meeting. And if you don't achieve consensus, then that issue gets tabled, if you can, and it gets brought up at a later meeting. Some boards say, no, we vote. And if you dissent, that gets recorded, and away it goes. Another board, their protocol was, we talk, we vote, and if you're in the dissenting opinion, then we try to massage our decision to allow you to feel good about it. So there's sort of a little bit of a halvesies approach. But all of that matters, and all of that tends to be kind of written down protocol on the board sometimes, but it can really influence what decision is made at the end of the day. We're nearing the end. All of this is tied to fiduciary duty. All of it stems out of fiduciary duty as the interpretation that each trustee carries in their own self about what their role is on the board. What is their stated role on the board? What is their perceived role on the board? How did that definition, how did that role get into their head or heart or wherever it is that they hold it? And sometimes boards are actively socializing trustees to a particular perspective, right? The chair of the board will say at meetings, that's not how we interpret fiduciary duty. Well, that conversation kind of just got shut down when the chair of your board says that. Or we send all of our trustees to this training, and then they come out of that training with a very particular interpretation of fiduciary duty. And that could be problematic, especially when you think of who's offering the training, what's the training about, what perspective is that training from. Fiduciary duty, there are lots of people working on trying to expand the legal definition of fiduciary duty. Lots of people argue that you can satisfy the fiduciary duty to protect the best interest of the plan beneficiaries and also not ruin the entire world. through your capitalist system. You can make maybe slightly lesser returns, but they're still okay returns. There's a growing body of literature around that kind of argument, but there's also a lot of tendency to narrow the definition, because a more narrow definition is an easier definition. It's an easier definition for boards to work around. It opens them up to less risk, to less discussion around these things. And this is the last quote, I promise. We have a fairly stringent standard under pension benefit standards to act in the best financial interest of beneficiaries. Most pension benefit standards would just say best interests. We believe, and this is a decision that this board, this plan made, we believe we have to act in financial interests, and we see good earnings in a sector like oil and gas, which almost every pension plan has. We will continue to do that because the law requires us to act in the best financial interests of beneficiaries. So that's a narrowing of the definition. That's saying, no, we're not going to go, we're not going to engage in these other triple bottom line, alternative, collateral, good things around investment. We're just going to look at the bottom line on paper. And so there's a mix of that attitude across different boards, and that gets taken up in different ways on different boards. So what does that mean for labor? What can labor do in this context? And oftentimes, or what I would suggest is there are maybe three broad options. One is to kind of double down on the aspirations, right? This is, no, we're committed to this. Participating in governance is important, right? And from a transparency, agency theory kind of perspective, by having trustees on the board, it's better than not having trustees on the board. We now have a better understanding of what's going on those boards. We're perhaps in a better position to influence what's going on those boards. And so one answer is that labor doubles down on the current way of thinking. But what that's going to mean is a whole lot more investment. Because right now, I would argue that the training is not sufficient to support the trustees in that way of thinking. There is not a clear agenda to double down to. There isn't a clear agenda, even within unions, individual unions, let alone across the labor movement, of what the best approach should be for pension investment. So that's going to take a lot of resources, and that's going to take a lot of thinking and acknowledgement, I think, about some of the contradictions that pension plans pose for labor. The other is to accept the status quo, which is just to keep doing what they're doing, which is essentially appoint trustees to the board, maybe send them to a little bit of training here and there, maybe put out a policy document here or there, but that's kind of it, right? And just sort of carry on, and maybe just sort of try to avoid any negative press that might come out when, you know, the teacher's pension plan buys up private daycare services or something like that. The other, and this may be not something that some want to hear, is to just like get out of the business and sort of go back to a much more fundamental interpretation or understanding or set of actions that unions have engaged in. And so in the union renewal movement, there's been lots of talk about, well, unions can do this now, and unions can do this now, and unions can expand their power base. And one of those ways was to get into the financial system, right? We'll change it from the inside. Maybe not. Maybe unions have to just go back to the streets, right? And go back to direct intervention, direct action on things that they know work, grassroots mobilization, and start going back to basics. Because there's evidence that this changing things from the inside perhaps isn't working. But these are all just kind of ideas that I sort of wrote on a slide. And really, I think from labor's perspective, there isn't a discussion about what to do. It's a status quo, and therefore let's not talk about these contradictions, which is perhaps itself the most problematic of any of the options. So that's where I will stop talking, and very eager to hear any response.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Who would like to start? Some of you have experience, I think. You could draw on your experience. Bernard.
Have you looked at the training Are there training providers in Canada? You know, is there like one institute of trustees that have a training program? Or is it sort of ad hoc? Company directors used to just learn on the job years ago.
Yeah, so I'm supposed to tell the camera what the question was so we can hear. Is there, what's the scoop on the training landscape? From a labor perspective, there's an organization called SHARE, which is the Shareholders Research and Education Center, something like that. They're based in British Columbia. They were set up by the labor movement to be an education center to provide sort of alternative education on being able to invest in socially responsible ways. And I think a lot of what happens is that the labor movement sort of says, good, go attend something that SHARE offers, right? Go and take some of that education. So it's a little bit outsourced. There are some unions who have invested quite a bit of time and money and effort into developing in-house education programs, trustee education from a labor perspective. QB's done a little bit. OPSU is a fairly activist public sector union with respect to pension plans. They've done some in-house stuff. Definitely in Quebec, which is our arguably more socially progressive province in Canada. The provincial legislator in Quebec mandates a certain type of training, and actually the Quebec Labour Federation has moved in to fill a little bit of that mandate. So there is quite a bit more mandatory training in Quebec that is being taken up, and the unions are involved in that. But it's very, very piecemeal, and most trustees go to the industry financial training, right? Go and take the Canadian Securities course at whatever college. Go down to the International Federation of Pensions and Benefits that has their conference in Las Vegas every year, and get indoctrinated in terms of your understanding of how to go about investing in pension plans. That's where most of them go. And there's no directory or association of trustees at all. Trying to figure out who the trustees are on pension plans in Canada is like finding a needle in a haystack. So they don't get together to share notes.
Yep.
Are there union people appointed by the people under, in terms of the union bureaucracy and that layer, putting other people in, we see in Australia that the union super funds were a creation of the Labor government at the time, and now they're becoming bigger than Texas. And they're becoming, finance capital is becoming so important that it becomes a public policy concern in terms of infrastructure strategy in Australia. The question of politics, rather than education and all the political pressure, industrial pressure from the members from below, in terms of changing of strategies of, for example, in Uni Super, which is the superannuation organisation that's linked in with the National Tertiary Education Union in Australia for higher education. There's a campaign going on to divest from Transfield Holdings. Transfield Holdings has just recently won a $1.8 billion contract to manage Manus Island, which it's subcontracted out to another company. But it's, the issues and debates around the union's relationship to Uni Super, the members' relationship to NTU officials that are appointing these people, that is going to become more and more important, I would have thought, in terms of taking that as a union organising opportunity rather than some sort of public campaign type, more amorphous thing. It could actually be used as a way of building unions if it was handled in a particular way, because that bureaucracy is appointing their own, and they eat their own, and they're part of their own. They're not us. It's a different. You talk about labour, but it's not labour, is it? There's a labour bureaucracy, and there's a membership, and they've got different interests, and that difference in interests, if it's if campaigns around that can actually be a positive benefit. So I just wanted your views on that.
Yeah, and the broad question is, where is the direction for potential change or difference coming, right? What's the role of the beneficiaries or the union memberships in some of this decision making? It's mixed. There's not a concerted sense that pension plan beneficiaries want anything other than a strong return. Sometimes they're educated into that thinking by their union reps. So one of the people whose quotes was in here went on to talk about, well, yes, sometimes we get these things up from the members and they say that they want to divest in oil and gas and yada yada, and this is particularly a hot topic in BC where they're talking about building a pipeline across environmentally sensitive areas and all this. And that Labour trustee was, so we have to just educate them about how that's not really what we're all about, because we're a pension plan and we just invest where they can get good returns. That's the exact opposite of what you just said. And that's coming from a senior Labour official. That's not to say that's every case, but there is enough of a mix that there's not a universal strong campaign around this. Unions are quite active in the broader campaigns. Let's save public pensions across the board. Let's expand the federal pension system, so not the occupational employer-based pensions, but bigger. And they'll happily kind of bring the membership or the average citizenry of Canada on board for those campaigns. Public sector unions are more active. They're trying to do more of that in terms of educating their members of the importance of maintaining public services to the jobs of public sector workers. But the pension piece is just one big slice, one slice in their bigger campaign around that and around following public sector jobs into the private sector and that kind of thing. I don't think pensions are really on the radar a whole lot of the rank and file membership of unions, and there's not a lot of feedback on those issues, at least now. Maybe I think in our in the aspirational sense, perhaps they could be used as a mobilizing tool if you got membership behind some of these issues. But for a lot of people, it's really tricky to separate. I'd like to retire well, and I also don't like tobacco. But at the pension board table, or oil and gas, or whatever, those things come head to head, right? And so in terms of an individual member's own philosophy and own ideology about their individual life, that's a hard choice to make. And I don't think it's gone as far as what you might suggest yet. Maybe it could, but it would be in the doubling down category of unions are going to have to really put resources behind that. Karen?
Some nomenclature we use around here is industry super funds, and there's this multiple industry super Australia that's effectively the advocacy body for the industry super funds, so the health tester and CBUS for the construction. And I'm just wondering, is there a similar sort of body in Canada? And that body, we have obviously, as Canada does, a gender pay gap, about 80% of women have pretty ordinary superannuation balances. So that group also advocates around those public policy issues for public and private employees. So is there something similar in Canada? And back linking it a little bit to the governance, does an organisation like that assist in diversity and boards to assist with the governance? Yeah,
I don't think there are a lot of additional kind of framing supportive bodies. You know, across our provinces we have sort of the pension regulator in each province that dictates kind of the rules for the pensions that operate in that province, but we're quite decentralized as far as that goes. And so the pension plans really are kind of representing a particular kind of worker in a particular industry, but also in a particular province. And there aren't a lot of kind of third-party bodies that are engaged in discussions around pensions. They're not to my knowledge anyway, but I'm more focused on micro level. But to my knowledge, it's the pension plans mostly are kind of doing their own thing. They come up against the pension regulator. They have to respond to that. If they're in the government sector, you know, in that the sponsor of the plan is the government, they also sort of have to navigate the wills or desires of the provincial or the federal government at the time. But yeah, you know, I've learned about these groups like Women in Super and stuff. We don't have bodies like that are sort of advocating for equity beyond some labor federations. You know, the CLC, the Canadian Labour Congress, which is our national labor federation, would engage in campaigns around equity and things like that, old age security, but not specific to the pension industry, I don't think.
Yeah.
That sort of probably addresses the area I was initially asked you about, because I've got a bit of a deficit on Canadian labour structures.
Yeah.
We've got the ACTU, Australian Council of Trade Unions, I think you just mentioned the Canadian.
CSC, yeah.
And I was just wondering to what extent that umbrella organisation does partake in this debate. And the second question I've got, in the Canadian context, how do ethically responsible, as you call it, socially responsible funds, how do they perform? Or what's the data, empirical data, relative to generic investments? Because it would seem to me if you're producing better results on that ethical investment side, you've got something to sell to your members, either in the private or public. So there's a dual question there.
Yes. So, right, in terms of the sort of labour federations, we have the National Canadian Labour Congress that the individual unions feed into if they want. Right. We also have provincial labour federations, so there are 10 of those.
Are they aligned to the Australian Labor Party equivalent in each of those states?
The relationship between unions and our political parties is fraught.
Okay.
Occasionally they align with our left-leaning party, which is the New Democratic Party, but it doesn't always shake out that way. So there's nothing concerted. And then in terms of, yeah, definitely, a trustee would say 100%. We will invest in whatever fund is performing the best. If that's an ethical fund, super duper for us. There are some trustees who try to advocate that they're not bad. They may not be the best, but they're not giving negative returns, so can we not choose them? Right. So that's kind of, overall, that's where these ethical funds sort of sit right now. I wouldn't say that there's... In the Australian
context, the empirical data would suggest that ethical funds are returning quite good returns.
Right.
Marries the Canadian experience.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like some of these, private sector industry funds the unions are running are doing really well. Whereas it's, they haven't received that kind of profile yet. They're still really at the margin in terms of the assets holdings that they offer. Yeah.
Another question? Yep.
I have to declare a few interests. A, I'm the CEO of Super.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. I'm Canadian, so my wife went to Western.
Very nice.
And I've been in this sector for 30 years. Yeah. So also an actuary. So I think a lot of stuff that you've said has been great. I think that the point of it, from my point of view, prudence, I've been involved in lots of trustee boards at the time. Prudence is really, really important. So to get a labor person on board, it doesn't matter how smart they are, they actually do add a lot of value. So anybody that questions that, they're wrong. But similarly, employers add a lot to boards, independents add a lot to boards, not necessarily as a tiebreaker, but because of expertise. So I think a lot of the stuff that you've said is right, but I think it's the combination of things that make things better. I can say lots of things. So they're not industry, they're not union funds in Australia, they're not union funds, they're industry funds. So they're made up of industry bodies as well as unions, and they do a great job. From an environmental, social perspective, or environment ESG perspective, we set up two new funds but 9 months ago, because people said we don't want to have fossil fuels up and so on. So we set up this new fund. It's actually achieved better returns in the last 9 months. But that's a fluke of time. Right? 2 years from now, it could be the opposite. I could say lots of things.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
No, and I think, in terms of, that's at its heart what the prudence law says, right? And is that it's the collective expertise of the board. And so, but still, you need to have enough base expertise of the board that you can question each other, right? And not sort of just say, well, the actuary said, and that's the only person who knows anything on the board about actuary science, so they must be right. That's, you know, you don't want to just completely engage in having silos of individuals on the board. But you can all kind of be raised up by that. And I think a lot of boards do operate that way quite well.
And just, many of you might be members of UniSuper. I think if I can, the advertisement is the board at UniSuper has 4 union, 4 company, or 4 university, and 3 independents. And they really do operate well. Are they always consensual? Not usually, or not always, but they do tend to agree on most things that they talk about. There was an issue, as you know, in the last 2 or 3 years that was a challenging issue, but they came to good decisions on that kind of stuff.
Marcus and I have grey hair, so we're reassured by your comments.
So what's your view then on investing in companies like Transfield?
Well, we divested from Transfield, but not specifically because someone said you should divest, get out of it because they're doing Manus Island. I think the argument, it comes down to that whole point about how tight is the definition of fiduciary. From a board's perspective, is this in camera? We're not. But from a board but from a board's position, I would say that typically we would consider it best financial interests of members. So we would not say we need to consider everything, but we try and consider it. So in Transfield's case, we felt that it was in the best financial interest of members to divest, not because it was best doing the Transfield or doing the Manus.
Other questions, comments, observations?
In Canada,
Yeah.
since, as Marcus mentioned earlier, since the 1990s with the introduction of compulsory superannuation contributions or pension contributions, what's the state of play historically in Canada with employer-based contributions to employee funds, whether it be private sector or public sector? I'm not sure what the structure is there historically. Is that a similar story in Canada in terms of contributions, and does that vary across different provinces, or is there uniformity across the entire?
There's probably not uniformity. It's probably close, to, similar scenarios, but provincially it's different. I don't have a good handle on sort of the Kathy and I were talking about earlier, like the historical evolution of the plans. Definitely in an employer pension plan, you would have employee and employer contributions.
Is there a minimum level? Or does that vary?
I don't think there is. There's a maximum level under the Tax Act that you're only allowed to have, 18% or something like that of your earnings going into a retirement vehicle, either an occupational plan or your own. But usually those levels are set by bargaining at individual levels. Some of the public plans are legislated by their own statutes, in which case the contribution levels would be more rigid. But usually they're just bargained.
Yeah. And also proportionately, public sector gets a lot more people into their funds.
Yes.
Private sector is probably less than 40.
Yeah, that's right. In the private sector, there are many smaller funds, whereas the big, powerful funds in Canada tend to be private sector. Public sector. Yeah. Great.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Anybody else? A reflection? An anxiety?
I have an anxiety.
Oh no, now we're going in.
You spoke about consensus and the different themes on the board. When you looked at the board characteristics, what did you find? Was it like leaning towards a particular professional consensus, or what were the backgrounds like? Were there similarities? I'm just,
Yeah, and I haven't sort of mapped out the board characteristics for sort of to really get into the context of where these comments come. That would be a good thing to do. The boards tend to be, most people who are serving as a labor trustee are union staff people and have been for a long time. Most of them sit on pension benefits committees, so they're quite versed in that kind of thing. The pension boards still tend to be mostly men in terms of, say, demographic characteristics. People tend to be older, so from that perspective. In terms of employer trustees, a lot of employer trustees are there because of their role as the employer, so they're the financial officer of the place, of the workplace. They are, and so therefore that person who holds that job gets on the board. So they usually have the sort of technical skills that we're talking about in terms of coming to the board. Independents are a little more rare in the Canadian context right now. I hear a lot about independents in the UK, where there are actually firms that have been set up that just feed out independents to pension boards. So if you're on a pension board and you need an independent, you just call up XYZ company over here and say, can I have an independent on my board, please? Which doesn't really happen in the Canadian context yet. I don't think even really in the US context. In the US, there are a lot more government ex officios that serve on boards than in the Canadian context as well. So there's difference across the different landscapes in terms of what composition you have. But usually they'll be senior employer people, senior union people on the board. Different unions have put forth more and less rigorous selection protocols. So some unions now are trying to have applicant pools where people start being trained on these issues before they even get on the board. They're becoming to be a more rigorous selection process. You have to have an interview. Some require you to do a little test. So unions are starting to kind of try to respond themselves to this issue of expertise. So that's starting to happen too.
Okay, yeah, Aaron, last one.
Yeah, I was wondering about what kind of theoretical framework you kind of thinking of taking this, because obviously I guess there's maybe potentially a class kind of dynamic to thinking about the background of the people on board, but also I was reminded of the fields that people kind of step in different linguistic and different fields like games. I'm one time a union member, I had a certain kind of purpose, and then the fiduciary purpose is a different one. There's with a different goal in each kind of set of rules that people are operating in. I wonder to what extent it's cultural and to what extent it's also enforced by the legal definitions of what fiduciary is.
I think a theoretical frame is a challenge because it's, there's a lot going on and there's not a lot of literature on this topic at all. There's definitely, you can sort of draw a corollary to research that's been done on corporate boards of directors. So you can talk about agency theory, you can talk about kind of that sort of environment and just try to sort of map it over on pensions. But it's more complicated than that. The institutional environment around pension trustees is more complicated, I would argue, than corporate boards. So I think there, you do need to kind of look to literature around fault lines. There's literature around how various fault lines or areas of disagreement occur within teams, within different bodies that has come out of there's someone in the legal environment in the US that's written a little bit about that. A little bit of maybe institutional theory in terms of kind of understanding people's perspectives of where they come. The psychological literature is sort of the standard role conflict, role ambiguity kind of stuff, and how do people deal with those. So the task would be to see what theory comes out of that pot. But yeah, if you have more ideas, we should talk about it.